One planet, different worldviews. And one of the reasons why this topic came up is based on my personal history. And I was for some years a minister in the Norwegian government, and I'm a social scientist by background. And one of the things I, of course, thought was that much of my decision-making would be influenced by social science, and indeed it was on many occasions, and I can even footnote some of the documents we sent to the parliament to important social studies, both in Norway and also in the international literature. And not only did we organize it that way, when we carried out some very important research, we also organized what we called follow-up research, basically seeing what did we achieve what we intended. And in some cases we did, in some cases we didn't, and then we tried to use the information that social scientists provided as a way of revising our policies. But then something funny happened on the way, and one was, again, based on my personal experience, namely that it clearly became evident to me that the only thing that entered my decisions was not based on social science research. We could call that also the empty head fallacy, which assumes that your head is empty and is basically waiting to be saturated by social science. I had all sorts of notions and beliefs, probably some of them myths, and I think therefore this is a very important question to address, not only at the national level, but also internationally. Where is it and who is it that shape our notions about how the world works? To give you just by one example, we have some very important and influential political commentators. One could use, let's say, Thomas Friedman as an example. And a few years back, he published a book which is called The World is Flat. And then, of course, that had an enormous influence on the way people perceive the world. And it, in many respects, was based on his travels. And in some ways also challenged what was the statement of a famous political scientist, Samuel Huntington, who had presented a different worldview on the clash of civilizations, which also influenced the thinking of many, but then based on some sort of social science argument. But the point is here that there are some important group of suppliers of worldview, so to speak, that tend also therefore to infuse our heads with notions about how the world works. And we wanted to address that by having people come here who combine different roles. And starting on my left, we have Jan Egeland. And Jan Egeland is, of course, he was a social scientist, and then he was siphoned into politics, first at the national level and then internationally. And now he has returned to research. And clearly it is therefore a type of person that we would like to reflect on this topic. Based on his experiences, Jan Egeland had a distinguished career in Norway. I will only mention that he was one of the key players in the development of the so-called Oslo process, the initiative that was taken to try to bring together Palestine and Israel and construct that on a new basis. And he played a very important role there behind the scenes and also to some extent on the scene. Later on, he was a very important actor in the United Nations system, played a key role in humanitarian affairs as an undersecretary in the UN system. And also then, in that role, which also is something he may want to reflect on here, as a, so to speak, cosmopolitan actor, also served to interpret the world to us as a global audience. What is happening in Darfur, what is happening in the other ways, is basically shaping our notions about not only what is going on, but also how to address it. And again, a key question is then, to what extent was his decisions and his mode of operation influenced not just by the social science he brought along, partly from his own research, partly from the research of others, but also based on the experiences that he had during that tenure. Then we have, all the way going to the right, Jinghai Zheng, who is now the president-elect of the Chinese Economic Association in Europe. He is an economist by training. He has also a distinguished international career as a scholar. He was trained partly in Gothenburg, and he has had several positions at the international universities at Cambridge, London School of Economics, Beijing, Tsinghua University in China, and he has also then taken on this role as I said, as now the president-elect of the Chinese Economic Association in Europe. And he brings also not only the perspective from his discipline and from the scientific work he has done, but also as one who has traveled from one culture to another, and I'm quite sure also from a culture which in many ways embeds in their citizens different worldviews from the ones that are typical of the West. Our worldview is that we are the West, and then there is the rest. That's according to the sort of soundbite that is often used. But I think, therefore, it will be very interesting also what he can bring to our discussion. And then we have Mariano Aguirre Ernst, who not only is a scholar, he has been that in Spain, and he has had very important positions in the as the director of the Peace, Security and Human Rights Program, FRIDE, in Madrid. He has now migrated to Norway, and he has taken on as director of the Norwegian Peace Building Center called NOREF. And it's interesting also that they had the wisdom to go abroad to get someone who could chair that institute, but he has another experience which he brings to this panel, and that he is a long-term commentator in Spanish newspapers like El País, but also in international journals like Le Monde Diplomatique, El Correo, and I could mention several more. He has also been a commentator on radio and so on. So he has had the double role, on the one hand, as a political actor, but also as a political writer. And therefore it's interesting to ask him, when you try to shape our worldviews, what is it that shape your worldviews? Is it based on, again, your studies, your social science, the basic paradigms you picked up? Or is it based also on your daily reading of newspapers, of following the news? And in which case, how is it that you put all the puzzles together? Because what you're trying to inform is about are not just new facts. It's basically interpretations. You're presenting interpretations. And what is it that, if you're not taking it from social science, from where do you take it? When you are trying to fill up our empty heads, what is it that fills yours? So this is basically the topic of this afternoon. And what we will do is first to give the floor to Jan Egeland. And you can, if you want to stand up, perhaps it's easier also for the audience to follow what you're saying if you stand over there. And the way we'll then have the discussion is that we will have the 3 presentations, and then they can make some quick comments to each other. We will then open the floor for discussion. We ask you then to use the microphone, because if you do, what you are saying is recorded. It will be for eternity, whatever your statement is, and it makes also reporting from the conference more easy. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, President Gudmund, for convening this. I think it's a very challenging. It's a very challenging theme you have put before us, and I look forward to the discussion. Indeed, for me, as a practitioner, it was often in my head when I was in the midst of all sorts of wars, conflicts, disasters. You know, shouldn't there be some social science-based truth that we could relate to? And there wasn't. So in many ways, what I would like to say, talk a little bit about here, is how far and how short international cooperation and international social science has come, in my view. And indeed, I have, since I graduated from university as a political scientist in 1985, I've spent more time with dictators and warlords and guerrilla leaders than with professors and with academics. So, of course, in many ways, I'm a practitioner more than an academic here. If I use then the humanitarian arena as my point of departure, remember that this is one of the most dynamic there is in international relations. And in some respects, it is unbelievably effective. If a disaster broke today, like the tsunami did on the second day of Christmas, we can and we could at that time have assessment teams, as we call them, within the UN system and the Red Cross and Red Crescent system, airborne within hours from various corners of the world. There is a plane, courtesy of the Swiss government, standby in Geneva, which can have some of the first experts on site within hours. They will, within hours, set up a virtual operations center, as it's called, on the internet, which will real-time provide assessments of needs, of the situation, of who are affected, how many are affected, what are the needs, what are the requirements for those who want to contribute, what's in the pipeline, what are the various logistical and other bottlenecks to get the goods into the country and out to the people. In the tsunami, for example, we've faced destruction in 12 countries, massive destruction in 3 countries, 90 countries contributed, 30 countries contributed military assets in the humanitarian relief effort, and nobody that we know of died because of lack of humanitarian supplies. Same thing in the Kashmir, or if you like, subcontinent earthquake that devastated northern Pakistan, big parts of northern India. So there is no limits, it seems, that we can do in this generation logistically, because we have the resources and the technology like never before. Now, there is also a great contribution from social science in all of this. The survey methods that is now being employed are, of course, have been derived from social sciences and from medical research. Motility surveys, morbidity surveys, malnutrition surveys, nutrition surveys are undertaken and are increasingly precise. Can be undertaken very quickly. The methods are such that tens of thousands of people can be surveyed, and you can extrapolate how the situation are within populations of millions very fast. Now, the more we work with natural sciences, in a way, the bigger and the better the results often come. Satellite imagery is now being used to find out where refugees go and settle, even in areas where we politically would have no access for humanitarian relief. So when Darfur was locked down 2004 and so on, it was known the 114 places where they settled, and operations were planned so that you could just have the system immediately enter the place when we were able to get access. Now, what is then the problem? Well, it's also amazing how we are not able to do and what we refrain from doing, if you like. For every place and disaster and area where we have lots of resources, lots of action, lots of social science research, lots of surveys, there would be a dozen places nothing is done. And I would like to then perhaps list 5 areas where I see, very interesting lacks of coherent action. Now, the first I've already mentioned. There is in many ways still no real relationship between actual needs and actual attention, resources, and actual response. In a place like Norway and most developed countries, we would say social security, pension rights, etc., should be according to REACH or some objective criteria. So how come internationally the Congo, which is, according to all surveys, the place on earth where we've lost most lives through direct violence and indirect results of war, disease and other associated with the conflict, how come the Congo gets a tiny, tiny fraction of the more of the conflicts and the affected peoples, which are much smaller but get much more attention? And this is systematic, the lack of attention, not only in terms of less money, less actual resource, but also less research, less focus, less attention, less media. Somalia, another case in point, Sri Lanka, etc. Compare that to the Balkans, the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan. Now the second point, also interesting. How come we've not been able to better measure how the international architecture today, outdated as it is from the end of the 1940s, how much that costs us today in terms of lack of security, lack of effective action. In other words, a Security Council of the UN, which reflects the Europe as it was after the Second World War, where some countries won and some countries lost. Compare that to the World 2009, where those who lost the Second World War are now the biggest contributor in Europe, from Europe to the UN, Germany, the biggest second overall, Japan, left out completely of the Security Council, except if they are elected, which they are every 10 years or so. Or India, which is soon to be the most populous country in the world, is not even there. Nor the regional powers that are the most influential on peace or war within their region. So this would be an area where social science research could just say, listen, we're losing a lot of money, we're losing a lot of security because we have an architecture which is not responding to today's situation. That might convince perhaps Europeans and others to say it's not right that we're sitting on 3 out of 5 permanent Security Council seats, for example. Now, a third lesson is what I would call, in this time and age, too often wrong countries push the right issues. Again, we don't reflect the new world as it is today. I worked a lot with Darfur, with Zimbabwe, with Burma, with Sri Lanka in my times in the UN, in the Norwegian government and elsewhere. In all of these cases, you would see Western powers really trying to do a lot, taking on the international quest. In nearly all of these cases, it appeared to be counterproductive. The West could not deliver neither peace, nor security, nor progress in Darfur. Couldn't. Tried to, could not. Britain tried really very hard to influence in Zimbabwe. It became counterproductive. South Africa could have done a lot. They stepped back. The colonial power, old colonial power, stepped forward. Burma, France called for humanitarian intervention when there was a cyclone where the Burmese generals kept out the rest of the world. China, ASEAN, could have done a lot, stepped back because they didn't want to be part of that particular thing. And you could go on and on. Sri Lanka, clearly India and ASEAN countries, etc. So again and again we come up and we see that those who have leverage are not anymore the Western countries, but the Western countries step up to the plate, try to take it on, and it becomes counterproductive. Again, somehow social science should try to convince and say it's counterproductive. It may look good in public opinion at home, but it's counterproductive where you want to help. So why continue? Why not ask Beijing, what's your plan for Darfur? What is your plan? Because we failed, what is your plan for it? That's what, in my view, Western leaders should ask. Now, perhaps one last point, which is and I think Mariano may be also addressing that. Popular opinion may very often will swing political opinion, but will also, it seems, swing social science research too often. One interesting point is, of course, how we could end up in the Western countries for years apparently agreeing that torture was the correct thing, seemingly. I mean, now, in retrospect, everybody thinks, how did we go collectively nuts for 5-6 years after Vice President of the United States said we have to go over to the dark side, very, very famously. Of course, there are many social scientists who would help argue to say that it's counterproductive, you don't get any information, it's illegal, it's immoral, it will cost us everything in the so-called war on terror, if you choose to call it by that. But still, it happened. And a lot of Western countries became involved in it. You know, again, how did we go wholeheartedly into something which was so counterproductive, so inefficient, so costly? Well, it seems because everybody was totally paralyzed by 9/11, including, that's my impression, including social science research. Now, I'll end up by a positive note. You know, it's probably one of the mistakes often of us, now I'm back to social science and research, that we're very problem-oriented and so on, and don't see progress. There's been a lot of positive progress. As I said, I mean, humanitarian work has never been more effective. There are 50% more peace and less war now than when the Cold War ended. There is more humanitarian action, human rights action, and so on. So just imagine what we could do if social science research came up, stepped up to the plate, and was able to deliver more real-time truth and evidence. Of course, there's a question, is it possible among other things in the areas I mentioned, is it possible, just imagine what we could do if we in a way were able to pick up the pace of technological natural science research, because never has there been better technology, more resources, more money available for international cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think what we'll do is we'll move straight on then to Jinghai Cheng. And would you like also to step up to the microphone?
Thank the conference organizer for organizing this session. And just about a week ago, I went through the introduction about the session. Gradually, I realized it was a really relevant session, especially to my situation, because just like Yan said, very often you found the social sciences were not there once you badly need them. And from my perspective, I wouldn't say it's a typical Chinese perspective, but especially the way I speak here probably is not typical Chinese. And since I probably will complain a lot in my note here. Yes, for example, from a point of view of economist, very often I felt it seems when you really need economics or economists, you couldn't find them. You couldn't find them when there was an IT bubble in the US. You know, lots of economists, they lost money in the stock market. They couldn't understand what was going on. And then there was a housing bubble. And now it turned out to be a financial crisis. And I was wondering, where was those economists? You couldn't find them. Yeah. Especially over the years, there was very influential book by Huntington, which was also mentioned in the organizer's note. I was wondering, where were the social scientists? I mean, it was a very important issue, but it seems the opinion was dominated by non-serious social scientific research. So here, I will start to approach the issue from the China's experience during the Cultural Revolution. And now I'll start my note here. Since the demise of the Soviet Union, the last 2 decades have seen rapid expansions of social sciences as academic disciplines in the transition economies, including China. Chinese scholars, in responding to the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, like the pioneers of the May 4th movement of the 1919, turned to the West for better alternatives to the orthodox approach that once dominated the modernization drive of their nation for decades. And just like the May 4th movement, science and democracy preoccupied the intellectual discussions in the early reform years of the post-Mao era. I remember I was only about 24 at that time, and I also organized a forum for discussing similar issues. Yeah. One of the major lessons learned from the tumultuous years of the Cultural Revolution for the Chinese intellectual community as a whole was about the important role that could have been played by science in the construction of a social infrastructure and the establishment of the education system, and in particular, in the decision-making process at the national level. As you all know, during the Cultural Revolution, the decision was made only by a few people or even by one person. And during that period, science was either seen as being self-promoting in the eyes of those who were used to the traditional way of thinking, or as a challenge to the prevailing political ideology in the society. In those years, higher education was virtually non-existent, and even basic education was largely affected. Textbooks were reduced to minimum. When I was in the undergraduate, in the primary school, the textbooks, all textbooks was very thin. And political correctness, probably which is different from what we call here, political correctness replaced mathematics and physics. We were poorly trained in science during that period. When the turmoil was over, to those scholars who were not allowed to practice their academic professions, science was like a long-lost friend and finally returned. To students who were deprived of opportunities for acquiring adequate knowledge for their age, the restoration of the higher education in science and technology provided tremendous opportunities for satisfying their intellectual curiosities. China started recruit college students after the Cultural Revolution, 10 years of Cultural Revolution in 1977. And I was recruited in 1978. Soon after the reform started, the appeal of science in general to the Chinese minds lies in that scientific laws are universal. Scientific truths are objective rather than subjective. And scientific approaches always lead to the discovery of further truths upon which an entire field of research can be established from scratch. Soon after the reform started, the nation as a whole realized that the mere acceptance of the natural science of the West was not sufficient to deal with problems encountered in a society that was undergoing substantial economic and social change. Fortunately, the experience of the West seems to indicate that science can not only explain how nature works, but as an intellectual instrument, scientific methodology is also capable of accommodating social dimensions. Thanks to the open door policy of the reform, those scholars who went to the West and had the first taste of economics practiced there were so much surprised that economics could be studied in a fashion that would be unimaginable during the Cultural Revolution. The first group of students arrived in the US in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And Chinese young scholars were particularly impressed with the pervasive use of mathematics in Western economics. The emphasis on empirical evidence with adequate data and the tolerance towards competitive schools of thoughts. And the most impressive of all was the practice of scientific methodologies that seem to be neutral of ideological influences. And I came to Sweden in 1988, and that was also the year I started my PhD education. And this is speak from my own experience. Later on, a significant portion of the entire generation of young scholars and students majored in natural science and technology, devoted their attention to social subjects such as management science and economics. Tens of thousands of Chinese students went to Western universities to study business administration, economics, law, sociology, and even political sciences. After 30 years of economic reform, in retrospect, the contribution of the social sciences to the successful transformation of the Chinese economy and society, and to China's integration into the world economic system cannot be overestimated. As the world is getting increasingly globalized, social sciences should also be able to play a pivotal role in the construction of an international system that can bring all peoples of the world together. So I think Chinese experience with social sciences has been very, very positive, and Chinese scholars in Europe, we are very optimistic about the possibility of using social science to solve the problems of the globalization. However, the last 2 decades, the situation with social science, or more precisely, the world social scientific community as a whole, has not been satisfactory. While there has been so much rhetoric about the clash of civilizations, no equally influential serious scientific work has been done with regard to the plausibility of the seemingly self-fulfilling prophecy. While so many discussions have been directed to the virtues of the Western democracies, few prominent studies on the conditions that functioning democracies can be built has emerged or widely publicized. Many beliefs created or fashioned seem to simply justify the need for enemies in one part of the world as opposed to the other part. Because recently I have been involved in a study about the potential growth in China and in the US. One of our findings was that US in the long run could only grow about 2.5% per year. Yeah. But for some reasons, US propped it up its growth rate to about 5% during the second half of the 1990s. So it was rather disappointing after the Cold War ended. It seems a kind of economic Cold War restarted again. But of course, I hope it will not be as serious as the real Cold War used to be. However, the experience of the Cultural Revolution tells us that the desire and the creation of fear for imagined enemies are symptoms of dysfunctional and self-destructive society. How come, while social science research has been done more than ever before, misunderstandings about how societies work have been so widespread? Perhaps as decision makers consume more social research on the one hand, But on the other hand, what was often missing in many international decision-making processes is a research agenda that equally involves scholars of different social, political, and ethnic background. Taking research on China as an example, sometimes researchers involved engage in studies that tend to reinforce their misperceptions about a culture that they have little experience of. Along with the undesired outcomes, what we have forgone in the research activities is the scientific spirit that once made the civilization in the West so much admired in the East. This is responding to Yang's request yesterday to say something about my view, my changing view of the West from the beginning of the reform and until now. This is why this is also related to the issue Yan raised just now. Why can't China contribute more to the humanitarian reliefs, in international affairs? The issue is that first we need to establish a relationship and communicate properly, especially the scholarly communication is very, very important. And so this is also part of my job now, and I will try my best. What are the criteria that a social science for world under globalization should qualify? Social science in a world of globalization should be based upon universally shared values and should possess no imagined enemies. This is like lyrics. Social science should be exercised to reach consensus among different parties equally involved in the globalization process, but not to spread beliefs manufactured for the dominance of the privileged few. Social science should aim at establishing industrial standards of its own. And I really feel we should call for independence of social science, more independent research. In economics, there's so much talk about central bank independency, and but now I think the central bank should be regulated to some extent, or central bank should do more regulation, And social science should aim at establishing industrial standards of its own, through which important issues may be subject to scientific scrutiny. Controversial premises can be analyzed with logically coherent framework. Genuine creative ideas are cherished, and truly innovative intellectual thinking appreciated. There might be social sciences of many, but a social science for globalization should encourage international cooperation instead of being obsessed with geopolitics. Just to quote from a note of the session organizer, that is to say, to refuse to go back to the 19th century. The major obstacle to the kind of social science we promote is simply ignorance. Because science brings people together, while ignorance separates worlds apart. Thank you.
All right, I will then immediately give the floor to Mariano. I'm very impressed by the fact that he has almost an hour ago stepped off the plane from the United States. So he comes from a combining straddling two cultures, but probably with one jet lag.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to this forum and also for the invitation to participate in this panel. So we have been invited here to present our ideas and about representations of global political issues, the construction of reality, and how popular beliefs are created. And I will try to respond, and I will try to respond also to some of your questions, the questions that you put it to us today, with concrete examples. Let me just remind first that interpretations of reality are constructed from different sources. Academic research is one of them, but the voices of journalists, civil society, activists, and pundits are also influential. The indirect impact of trends, for example, the current financial crisis, politics, culture, counterculture, and I would say also ignorance, something that you just mentioned, play crucial roles in generating ideas and opinions about the world we live in. In this complex world, there are multiple, probably infinite perceptions and views about the facts. I will argue here 4 points, and I will use 2 apparently disconnected examples. The examples are globalization and its impact, particularly on, I would say, the human factor in globalization, and on the other hand, torture. My aim is to show how the public beliefs about some crucial facts, as these 2, may change and may have a closer approach to what we can call the truth. So my first point is that we live in a globalized world, but as the title of the session indicates, worldviews about it vary greatly. The second is that the globalized world that we live in does not provide for the basic human needs of 3/4 of the world's population, and does not enable most of people to live a decent life. The absence of a human environment, which some analysts call now a human security environment, aggravates conflicts over economic interests, political power, natural resources among countries and communities. At the same time, grievances and resentments have fueled identity conflicts and foment the use of religion, nationalism, and other forms of identity to legitimate the use of violence. Third, that the optimistic theory of globalization has clouded our understanding of the real facts of life, particularly the harsh life of billions of people. The basic assumption of globalization theory, popularized by commentators as Thomas Friedman that you mentioned here, was that the road would be hard, but at the end of the tunnel we would reach the liberal light of capitalism and democracy. And with this implicit promise, exploitation, poverty, genocides, wars, and violation of human rights were sort of collateral damages, dirty benchmarks, until a better world will be achieved. My fourth and final point in this introduction is that although the optimistic globalization theory has been very powerful, at the end of the day, reality has overwhelmed this ideal vision of the world, and although painful, we have reached in this moment a significant moment which should enable us to see and understand at least part of our reality. We only need to focus our attention on the last 8 years, since September 2001, to observe, for example, the failures of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the failing and violent situation in Pakistan, the failed negotiations in Sri Lanka, catastrophic situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, particularly for women subjected to sexual violence, and the aggravation of the environmental crisis, just to cite a few of the worst examples in which the international community, something that Jan Egeland explained before, has not been enough active. But I think that in the field of globalization, the definitive failure have been the 2007 food crisis and the financial crisis of 2008. Millions of people have lost their jobs. Millions of unemployed immigrants are forced to return to their countries of origin, which are now even more impoverished. Failing remittances and returning immigrants are debilitating the fragile economies and state structures of the more than 50 countries known as fragile states. The theory of globalization maintains that economic transformation and fast communications have created a world with an increasingly global culture, which tend to impose liberal democracy and market economy as the hegemonic models. However, between 2001 and 2008, this theory has been challenged by numerous critiques, and even more so by the ever-worsening reality in the wake of this 2008 financial crisis. What we are now beginning to know also is that globalization cannot take the place of the individual history of each nation and each community. It can't absorb the different identities of the world, and it has uneven effects. In fact, liberal capitalism has not integrated millions of people and has created greater marginalization. This harsh reality has emerged, and the academics, commentators, politicians, and journalists who defended this ideal world of globalization have now been superseded by most, I would say, moderate and radical critics. Some of their analysts suggest that what is needed is not just an injection of reserve funds, but a major shift in the economic and political paradigm, thus leaving behind what the late sociologist Raymond Williams called more than 20, almost 30 years ago, the Plan X of short-term profits which failed to consider the human cost. Therefore, globalization offers us the opportunity to question, on the one hand, this false construction of reality, that promise of a Thomas Friedman flat world of democracy and prosperous economy for all, and on the other, the hard reality of massive unemployment, with people being forced to migrate in no man's land, drowning in the Gibraltar Straits trying to reach Europe, and the new wave of homeless people even in the United States that began with the Katrina and continues with the latest economic meltdown. So we have here two sides of the same reality, the mythical and the real. And this is a perfect example of how the influence of fashionable experts and opinion leaders, the short-sighted vision presented by the mainstream media, the scarcity of independent-minded scholars, and the reluctance of governments to recognize the critiques of social movements and radical thinkers, let's say from Porto Alegre to Joseph Stiglitz, can all contribute to generate a situation in which the world has lost the resilience and instruments to deal with the crisis. It also illustrates why people such and so different as the Queen of England and writer Mario Vargas Llosa both asked in 2008, how did we come to this? Why nobody warned us about it, mixing royal ignorance with liberal cynicism? My second example, which illustrates the power of different views on the same fact, is the debate on the use of torture in coercive interrogations. I will try to show how the different views clash on this hot issue of torture. From 2001 onwards, the highest level of the US government approved the use of practices such as waterboarding, defined by the International Red Cross Committee and the human rights organizations as torture. The fact that dictators and their subordinates authorize and endorse the practice of torture is unfortunately habitual. It's a common thing. However, when the government of a democratic country as the United States consider to be the incarnation of democracy, legitimates abusive practice on prisoners, a turning point has been reached. There are at least 5 different narratives around the use of torture after September 11 that I will brief here. The first is the pragmatic one. Torture is necessary to protect national security. And thanks to coercive interrogation techniques, thousands of lives have been saved, as former President Shiney is fond of repeating these days. In order to protect officials who approve the use of torture and to legitimize its practice, the Bush administration requested legal experts to reinterpret international legal instruments and domestic US laws. Lawyers prepare memorandums explaining that in times of war, the use of torture was justified and habeas corpus could be suspended. The Geneva Convention, which outlined the rights of war prisoners, was nearly sidestepped by defining terrorists as unlawful combatants, who as such had no rights to legal assistance, and still many of them are in the same situation. A sophisticated version of this narrative was provided by a number of prestigious academics, such as Michael Ignatieff, currently candidate for Prime Minister of Canada. In 2004, while he was director of the Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard, and I would like to stress Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard, Ignatieff wrote a book asserting that torture should be condemned, but in some cases, using it might be necessary, albeit with a special authorization case by case. An astonishing caveat by Ignatieff was to say that even if torture has been approved, the official, soldier, or CIA agent using coercive techniques may be prosecuted in order to prove that the democratic states cannot violate its own rules. And this is something really nice to say from Harvard, sitting as an academic. While Ignatieff and others took front stage to support the US government and their accomplices, for example, the British government, by means of their academic prestige, other experts and media commentators oversimplify the arguments, thus distorting the human rights and political debate. For these cheerleaders, the debate about torture was a distraction from a crucial task of defending the US from future terrorist attacks. Also, the directors and scriptwriters for TV programs, for example, the famous program 24, injected a consensus in favor of torture as a powerful tool against enemies. The second view, or the second narrative about torture, is the legal one. A body of legal instruments such as the Convention Against Torture, the Geneva Convention, and a broad jurisprudence in the use of torture provide a powerful and rich body of law against abuses. When the prestigious academic Ignatieff says in his book, The Lesser Evil, that many intelligent people, I'm quoting him, do not know what torture is, he is ignoring the whole set of legal instruments that explicitly define what we are talking about when we talk about torture. When the academics paid by the Bush administration wrote that in times of war and emergency, the president is allowed to suspend habeas corpus, they were distorting the human rights law regime. The White House and the Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, together with their legal advisors and the Ignatieffs of the world, backed up by the media who show that torture could make a successful TV show, have all contributed to a legal controversy that is still alive in the courts of the US. Discussions range from the legal protection of unlawful prisoners in Guantanamo to bizarre debates on whether torture is useful or not. And I think that the problem here is not whether torture is effective, but if torture is a human civilized behavior. The role of civil society organization to, I would say, counter and criticize this kind of narrative, organizations like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, has been, and it is still crucial to denounce, but not only to denounce, also to put pressure on the state to recognize its own rules and its own commitments. Lack of respect for international law went hand in hand with the lack of recognition and respect for other peoples and cultures. In the case of Muslims, as Todorov explains, we have a reductionist view of the others that facilitates the use of violence against them. The somersault is triple. First, the Muslim population is reduced to Islam as the sole guiding rule in their life. That Islam is reduced to Islamism as a political movement. And finally, Islamism is equated with terrorism. The third narrative is the one provided by what I would call the operators, the soldiers and the CIA agents who are now starting to talk. For some of them, torture was a part of their jobs, a nasty part, which had to be done. When, for example, a specialist, Sabrina Hartman, told the journalist of the New Yorker, Philip Gourevitch, about her experience in Abu Ghraib, she expressed candor and appeared to lack a real awareness of what she was doing. She captured with her digital camera, hundreds of human rights violations. And when she was there in the photograph, always with a smile and making the V for victory, as she used to do, and she said, as she explained, in every snapshot since she was a child. Only after some months did she start to consider that maybe torturing and killing people was not correct. And when the Abu Ghraib photographs reached the public, and thanks to some journalists, as for example Seymour Hersh, then a new narrative was created, also as a counter-narrative to the other one. In 2004, Susan Sontag, the late writer Susan Sontag, she wrote in the New York Times that violence and torture came to be seen as entertainment and fun in American culture. But for others, and some CIA agents are reporting in the media these days, orders came from the top, and they practiced torture in good faith to save their country. This narrative seems to be simple, the narrative of the operators. They were just doing their job. But it clouds a crucial point that has been raised by Richard Sennett in his seminal writing about work in modern capitalist society, that in our world today, work is disconnected from values, from social integration, and from the creation of social networks. A job in the current global market is a difficult thing to get, but its human value is very cheap. And the fourth narrative is represented by the Arab and Muslim worlds. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and other black holes, plus the extraordinary renditions, are seen as symbols of Western attacks on the Arab world. The violation of privacy in Iraqi and Afghan houses, attacks with drones on Pakistani villages, and the use of tortures are expressions of what many people in the Arab world consider is a fact of life, the attempt by the West to destroy Arab religion and culture. Further still, the practice of torture, inadequate protection for prisoners, and the transfer of some of this to Egypt or Syria to be tortured has confirmed the alliance between the West and local corrupt dictators. And at the end of the day, torture is also, for some of them, a good pretext for Arab dictators to halt the democratization processes in their countries. And it legitimizes the Western torture, legitimizes militias in Darfur, the oppression of women, and the education of thousands of children in madrasas to hate the West. The fifth narrative is a historical one. British philosopher Paul Gilroy argued in his book After Empire that there is a clear line of continuity between the colonial and imperial past and Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. The destruction of the welfare state, indifference towards the common good, and the rise of privatization and savage capitalism have destroyed the multicultural society, setting the agenda against diversity, plurality, and multicultural societies. Diversity is becoming dangerous. Paradoxically, we are told that we live in a globalized world, but at the same time we are contaminated with the idea that living with the others who are different, with the unknowns, is dangerous. And at the end of the day, we can close the door to immigrants and open the doors of the Iraqi houses without asking for their permission. We can bomb Pakistani villages without warning, and we can torture people and condemn them to live for the rest of their lives without a fair trial. That is the real world that is now emerging, thanks to some journalists, academics, human rights activists, legal experts, soldiers, and military officials, economists, and civil society organizations. Let me end with two images. The first one is the boat full of African immigrants, all of them almost dying, reaching the coast of Europe. The other image is the image of modern torture that is fixed in our minds. I'm talking about the photograph, I'm talking about the prisoner standing on a chair, his body shrouded from head to foot, wire ties to his hand, the pose of crucifixion, and the picket hood, The picture, says Philip Gurevich, transfixes us because it looks like the truth. But looking at it, we can only imagine what that truth is. Torture, execution, a scene staged for the camera. So we size on the figure of the prisoner as a symbol that stands for all that we know was wrong at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, and all that we cannot or do not want to understand about how it came to this. So social scientists, journalists, and practitioners, we and also the others, must work together so that we will always know how and why the world that we are in is the way that it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have now 45 minutes for comments and discussion. I think perhaps I should let also the panelists comment on each other if they wish. I think one of the striking things was that I think Jan first presented a fairly optimistic picture, saying that when it came to logistics, the new ways, for example, of identifying where refugees and so on, and also carrying out surveys for needs, that here is an area where social science is able to do some good things. But then you ended on a, as I read or heard you, a pessimistic note, saying basically, are we, if we only were able to deliver. So the question is, do we have anything to deliver? Is social science, so to speak, shelfware, so that when we face a problem, we can pull out the right book and we can apply the prescriptions, so to speak, in that book? Then I think Seng was, in many ways, very optimistic in the view that if we get the right science in place, there are things that we can in fact do. On the other hand, you also said that, well, the pessimistic version, or the flip side of what you said, was that when it came to the global crisis, the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, the financial crisis, basically two things happened. One was that social scientists didn't know what the hell was going on until it was too late, and now they don't have all that good prescriptions. And finally, in the last intervention, I think we are told the story of where social scientists are indeed providing something, but it is basically justifications for the powers that be, which basically also lead us into key political initiatives that are non-humanitarian, that are leading us astray, so that basically what social scientists have been doing in this case is to take us down the wrong path, so to speak. So there is a mixture here of some fairly optimistic messages, but also very pessimistic. And I could ask more specific questions. Jan, can you reconcile your two views of social science? And I think you also, in a sense, have some explanation to do, Cheng, because on the one hand, you use social science to construct the world, but clearly there were some misconstructions. And then finally, to the last speaker, can social science be used to correct its own mistakes? So this is a sort of quick opening.
Well,
of this discussion.
yeah, quick opening, big questions and a quick opening. Indeed, I tried to end optimistic. I mean, one of the big questions, in a way, for the big question for the social scientist is it getting better or is it getting worse in the world, in my view? And the answer is, thanks to social science, surveys and the like, we can now say that definitively, for a very clear majority of us, the world has been getting steadily better for the last 15 years. I mean, it's dramatic positive figures in terms of war and peace, in terms of standard of living, in terms of child mortality, in terms of access to social goods, etc. And now we're not talking about 50%. I mean, we're talking about at least 2/3 of the world population has lifted up a little, or has, like us, you and me, Goodman, Norwegians, filthy rich. 5 times we've had an increase of 500% in our lifetime. It's amazing. Now, so of course social science research is part of this. What I think perhaps we all try to explain is that social science research seems still to be lagging. I mean, are we doomed forever to be lagging behind our natural science colleagues? I mean, they're way ahead of us. And in a way, the very eloquent example of Mariano here of torture is that, we have all of these people now going all over the world, being very real-time into struggles against terrorism and so on, and all of these methods there, and suddenly, people believe it's a necessary thing, it's a good thing, etc. And this, the one step back and saying, it's immoral, it's wrong, it's crazy, it's counterproductive, and so on. Didn't happen. So I think this is, of course, what is often called, wasn't it Huxley who said, where technologically we're superhumans, in terms of conscience, we're still in the Middle Ages. So here in a way is the question: can we become more real-time, catching up with the technological, economic progress that we've had, and that I so dramatically saw, for example, in international logistics? We can do things that are unheard about from North Pole to South Pole in no time.
Sang, would you make some comments?
I think my complaints was very similar to Jan's. Jan said logistically we have so much capacity, excess capacity, unused for humanitarian reliefs. The same thing goes with social sciences. And I felt social sciences in the West still so much advanced, just like in the beginning of the reform in China. People see the Western technologies were so advanced, and it could have solved almost everything. And so the problem with social sciences today is that how to mobilize the potential capacity nowadays in this world. And after the Cold War, as I mentioned in my note, the social sciences have been expanded largely to the transition economies. And but those resources, the researchers, they were not utilized or efficiently utilized. And so if there is a kind of institutional arrangement to the extent that we can mobilize all the resources in this world, social science, scientific resources in this world, we would be we would have been in a much better position than we are today. And the obstacles, as I said, it was probably mainly ignorance. Ignorance leads to misunderstanding, also lead to the kind of protective politics, or so-called geopolitical politics. And as I remember, after the collapse of the U.S. Financial market, there were articles talking about geopolitical consequences of the financial crisis. Of course, that's a real issue, but on the other hand, why geopolitics was the first thing came to your mind? That was a problem. And so this is why I think social science should be more independent, should set up its own standard, and should promote or fashion or even create beliefs that can be widely accepted in the society. And if social science cannot really influence or cannot be really in the part of the decision-making process, but at least social science should be able to hold its own view and its own beliefs and its own principles. Yeah.
Mariano?
Yes. Well, first of all, I think that if I did it right, my message was to some extent optimistic in terms of what I tried to show, that although some social scientists or academics, some media stars, some governments, some officials try to generate, for example, a consensus favorable in favor of the mythical view of globalization on the one hand and on the legitimation of torture on the other, at the same time, I try also to show that very relevant academics and lawyers, for example, in the United States, some organizations at the civil society level, some journalists, some filmmakers, they all generated a counter-argument in the two fields. And although it's true that at the same time, I mean, it's very interesting, and we have in the time here to explore all the different, I would say, relationships between the political environment and the possibilities that the voices that were not enough heard in 2002 or 2003, now they can have an impact. I mean, organizations like Human Rights Watch, for example, or Amnesty International, they started to denounce the situations in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo in 2002. And apparently for some people, they were not listening to that until 2005 or 2006. The mainstream media, for example, in these days, the New York Times, is very active in favor of the state, and all the officials of the Bush administration should be accountable for what they did on torture. But the New York Times took a lot of time until it was really active about that. So, I mean, it's very interesting, and still we don't have the time, but also to see that it's not only a confrontation between, let's say, the good academics and the bad academics, between also the social movements, that there are some in the United States in favor, for example, of even of torture, or the right groups. I think we need to put also this kind of confrontations in the context, and the context of the delegitimation of the Bush administration, the delegitimation of the Blair's government in Britain, and the financial crisis were three factors that helped to some extent, and also the Obama factor that helped that these debates on globalization and torture became to the forefront. I would like just in 1 minute to stress, I think, some implications that I understand from these examples. The first is that academia, this is very obvious, that academia needs to be serious and rigorous and accountable to society. I mean, in terms for accountable, I mean that it needs to be in that kind of interrelationship, in order that some academics, and for me Ignatius is the most perverse example in the last years, that an academic that is the director of the Human Rights Institute can't really justify torture. And it took a lot of time until the New York Times stopped publishing his articles, until, some people are starting to criticize him. The second is that we need very dynamic civil society organizations. The example of the US in this moment, I think, is very important, in the way that the Obama administration is trying to forget all this dirty story, and how the civil society organizations, and in this moment the media are cornered the administration, saying, no, you should do what other governments, for example in Argentina, in Chile, they did with the people that torture other people. And the third thing is something that I think is also relevant now for Norway, is that we must not take for granted that advances in our laws and in the society are there forever. I mean, that in issues like racism and in issues like, for example, torture, in issues as, I would say, these reactions from society that will be mobilized by, for example, commentators, by the media, it's very important to be aware about that. Because, I mean, we don't even, I mentioned Norway because it's a very consolidated country in terms of law, but also the US was. And now in the US they are still discussing if torture is torture, if torture is just a good method to protect the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the floor is open. We have the first speaker here on the first row. So please, if you can use the microphone, you're welcome.
I'm from London. I worked for Amnesty. I had the honor of studying and working during my study in Amnesty International for 7 years. Also, I have to say the presentation was so interesting, valuable, painful, positive, reality. You said pessimistic. Unfortunately, that pessimistic is the reality of the world. At the moment, we are living 21st century, highest advanced technology, but the lowest humanity. Torture, you mentioned, is completely right. I live in London. I work for United Kingdom's government as a legal representative for human rights, but still we have a freedom fighter in one country, but they are coming to democracy, to heart of democracy, in heart of Europe. They are seeking for freedom, for safety, but they suffer in detention center as an asylum seeker. This is my comment, but the question is how much influence you and your organization have and are able to change these constitutions, these regulations, and especially you, sir, how much influence you can have to have a voice for these people. They are suffering in silence in the name of democracy and law and political activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should we take a couple of more questions? Yes, please, if you can come up.
Hello, my name is Heidi Nilsen. I'm from Bodø Graduate School of Business in Norway. I would like to draw the attention to mainstream economics and the hegemony it has had on policy recommendation and the impact it has had. And as a student and as a researcher, I've discovered how implicit the worldview of mainstream economics is presented. Dr. Seng said that we should look, or social sciences present itself like a neutral science, or we would like to have a neutral science and a common belief. But I would like to point that there are beliefs and there are different beliefs, and mainstream economics is not a neutral science, and when you use it you should argue why this tool is the appropriate tool. Why is utility maximizing the appropriate tool in this question at hand? It is not a tool that should be used whenever on all matters all over the world, and especially with regard to the big differences between industrialized countries and poor countries, and where in some countries, of course, maximizing consumption is still an important issue, where people are about to starve and are dying from starvation, whereas in richer countries, this maybe is not longer the goal. So my question is, to what extent do social scientists and in particular mainstream economics make this their worldview explicit and transparent, and say, when we choose this paradigm, what have we left out? What is not taken into consideration? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should we take one more comment or question in this round? Okay, not then Jan, will you start off?
Well, I mean, perhaps first, which influence do we have? It's a very good question, really. I mean, on one level, I often find myself that the good news is that, as social scientists, we're not, in more and more society, we're not curbed. We can speak out. We can go to the press. There is a plurality of possibilities to get out with your views. In Norway, a tiny country, has 125 newspapers now all over the internet. We can express ourselves, but are we heard? No, not necessarily. And I also find that, you are more and more going in like one direction. So, and it's a good, again, back to Mariana, is a good example, how all of the journalists and social scientists of the New York Times now, are full blast on torture, a few years after it really was at its worst. So I'm a little bit back to we're too much behind the curve here, too often, all of us. Is there a possibility to be before the curve if the political and public opinion is on an issue? Can you then really be heard? I don't know. It's harder. It's very. It is not so easy to be heard if you're not in sync with a public opinion. But then the whole point was for social science was to correct in a way what is popular emotion and popular opinion. Is there a neutral science and should we actually flag where we stand? Well, it is interesting to see. I remember just now we had the Nordic Foreign Affairs Institutes meeting our Chinese counterparts. And it was very interesting to see that we were supposed to be, trained social scientists, political scientists, meeting, one world, one science. It's very clear we came from very different traditions. We saw the world differently. And in the end, of course, our Chinese counterparts ended up in a way in a position which they didn't want to be in, which was to defend, their own country and their own system, and point to the hypocrisy of the West, which is criticizing, the South or the East for doing things that also happens within the West or happened within the West. And we saying, of course, we criticize ourselves and new ones. I mean, it's interesting. We take different roles, and yes, we should flag. We come from traditions. We come from traditions that really color the way we express ourselves, the way we approach things, and we end up in what was it? I mean, worlds apart in one global system.
I do think social science has a neutral part. It's fundamentally human beings are the same. Otherwise, there's no point to talk about globalization. And but of course, on the other hand, there can be different branches dealing with different issues. It should also be able to accommodate cultural differences. And for example, humanitarian reliefs, if it's necessary, then I do think Chinese would like to help. But the problem is that if you don't have enough communications at intellectual level, for example, and the Chinese diplomats, they will not be able to help very much because they take orders from above. And the national policies was made by the diplomats. It was made by politicians. Then politicians will also be influenced by theorists, policy analysts, who are usually professional researchers. So in that sense, to improve the situation is to improve the communications at the intellectual level, professional level, and to gather the researchers, social scientists, all over the world together, to work together for a common agenda. And of course, this common agenda should be able to accommodate differences. And Norwegians, they still can raise their Norwegian flags. And Americans, Chinese, they all have their own flags. But the fundamental thing is that we should work for common prosperity, peace, and humanity, so humanitarian work. And so for these reasons, I do think there is a common ground for social sciences and social science to work together.
Mariana?
Yes, thank you. I would like to do some two short comments to the two questions. The first is about your question, how much influence the organizations or our organizations or your organization could have or may have. And I must say that, I'm sorry to say that, but it probably is the wrong question. The problem is not what every organization can do. The issue is, and the thing is to understand that the influence and the capacity to, let's say, move forward some messages or some understandings or some explanations about reality is something that should be constructed by different actors. This is something that, for example, the right understood very well in the US in the 80s and in the 90s, in which they never try only to have one politician or a group of politicians in the Senate and the Congress trying to pass one law. What they did was to contract and to build up a civil society organizations supporting some congressmen. So I'm not only meaning activism. What I'm meaning is that nobody in the complex world of today can build one idea and move through the idea and setting the agenda with that wonderful idea, whatever the idea it is. Today what we need, and that's the reality, it's not only what we need your organization, our organization, the academics, the decent media. I mentioned the filmmakers, the radios, we need the civil society, and we need an educated public opinion or societies. That's why I stress ignorance in my presentation. So it's very important to have this sense that we need plurality, not only as a nice word, but plurality is also, I think, is a sort of utilitarian instrument for the political debate. The second point is about your question on to what extent the social scientists make make explicit the worldview, and it's just something like a I would say a sideline comment, is what I call the media temptation of the academics. I mean, for the academics, they love now to be in the media. They love to be on television. We all like to be on television and on the radio and make comments and say things. And I think that we need to also to understand, if we use the example or my example, but we are mentioning more or less the same about the financial crisis. You have in this moment people, for example, as Stiglitz or Paul Krugman, that I think that they really do an effort of providing the complexity of the situation in 900 words, and 900 words the next week, and 900 words the next week in another column, and then producing a book and debates on the television, etc. And I think that they, in general, they do it right. And on the other hand, I think the other example is the example of Thomas Friedman, that he doesn't work with explanations, he works with the slogans. The world is flat, and now the world is green, and yesterday the world was whatever. And the Middle East is just a letter to the president saying, this is what you should do. And this exactly, I think, the worst of the temptations for the academics in their relationship with the media. So I'm in economics, and I'm not an economist. I think that the best example of very good academic, very profound and complex, trying to explain economics for the people is the late John Key Galbraith. And I think that Krugman and Friedman are, I'm sorry, Stiglitz and Krugman, I think are along the same tradition.
Thank you very much. Is there any last comment or question from the audience? We are beginning to approach the time where we should break. If not, just is there one there that I say?
Yes,
yes, please. I'm sorry, I have the light right in my so I have to scream. Thank you for making me aware.
My name is John Forgy from Cameroon. Congratulations for the interesting paper. And Jan, thank you very much for standing your ground. I know it was not easy during your period within the UN. I just want to make one or two comments. Social sciences had its heydays, especially if we look at the independence of African states. Unfortunately, it looked like social sciences fell on the wayside. There appeared to be the rising expectation turned out to be rising frustration and destruction. And it looked like there was a kind of a ganging up between Western social science and the so-called emerging elites within developing countries that destroyed the whole process of development. So my simple question is, where do we go from here? Thank you.
All right. Short question.
This is for Jan, I think.
Where do we go from here? Yes. No, I mean, I think it's true. I mean, we there was this notion that you consulted with someone in Cameroon, and you were totally in sync with Africa, and then we employed our very naive early development assistance or whatnot. Again, I'm more of an optimist now than ever before. I think a lot has changed to the better. I think there is better consultation now among, for example, in development cooperation, it's called now development cooperation. It's not development aid anymore. There is better consultation. There is better capacity building. There is a better understanding of a lot of things. The United Nations, in my view, work better today in the field than it's done ever before in its 50 years. And then I open the parenthesis. So it's strange then that the West went to war unilaterally in Iraq, and then first in Afghanistan, which was in retaliation to some extent. The other one was unilateral craziness. And we ended up by saying, let's forget everything we learned the last 50 years, and let's start from afresh. And let's not involve the United Nations, not involve nation-building expertise. Let's not do anything of that. Let's use NATO, new tools, bilateral, Blackwater, whatever. Very interesting. Because there is a lot of knowledge and good cases. And also from Africa, a lot of best practices. Africa has a lot of success stories, as you know. Africa has had more peace building than any other continent the last 10 years. More peace building, more successful peace building than any other continent the last 10 years. So this makes me a little bit of an optimist. What I think, back a little bit to my example of China again, where I think we need to struggle more to get a better dialogue is this one thing, and we'll struggle with that in social science, and we're ending now. I think we're not comprehending that the West is less, and in relative terms, less and less influential. So in the West, in a way, perhaps again, a typical debate in Bergen is, what should the Obama administration be doing here, there, and everywhere? And we don't realize that the Obama administration is not able to do a lot of things here, there, and everywhere. In AFPAC, they will be very important. But they won't be very important in most parts of Africa or in most other parts of Asia and elsewhere, nor will, for that matter, be necessarily the European Union. It will be the regional powers. It can be China and so on. So I think we have to, in a way, say, how can we get this new system where the international orchestra have to work better, and China is willing to take the lead on issues. China should take the lead on Sudan, in my view. The West has fundamentally failed, and China's unwillingness to take the lead on Sudan is bad for human rights, it's bad for business, for China and everybody else, and it's bad for the people of Sudan, because they are locked in a conflict that they are themselves unable to get out of. This is, this is where we lack a dialogue, and where I think social sciences on both sides can help.
Mariano, you had it, and Schenk first, okay? Schenk first?
I can go first. Just in responding to Jan's comment on China, actually, I was in one of your dialogue with the assistant to the Minister of Chinese Foreign Ministry, and it was quite interesting. But I agree, China can do more, and I do think China has a different approach, which may work better in Africa. And on one hand, I think the West, or US plus Western Europe, they have a different mind setup, which probably is difficult for African culture, to accept. Secondly, I do feel, especially if we see the financial crisis now, so the U.S. even plus Europe actually have less capacity than they used to imagine. So this is where China can come in, but for China to be involved officially, or to the extent that could be effective, then you have to have enough communication before the policy can change. Otherwise, I think the Chinese government will always be skeptical of what the Western intentions are. And for example, I have been in Sweden for 20 years. I would say, on one hand, I was typical Chinese. I simply mind my own business. And so in 20 years, I accumulated so large academic capacity. And, but on the other hand, I hardly noticed what the Swedish society was really concerned about. But if you come to me and asking me for help, then of course I do have the capacity. If I understand you correctly, then I will do it. So, but now the problem is the communication channels are too few. Very often, I think even in Sweden, people were simply satisfied with the communication at this kind of superficial level. Go to ministries and invite top professors from the top universities just to some soft talking. And each side know very little about the other side. So I think the efficiency of the communication is not high.
Okay, Mariano, you will get the last few words.
Thank you. I would like to follow what Jan Egeland said about that the West is less influential. And I think that that's also key for the discussion that we are having here. Because we are really, I think, living now in this multipolar world. And this is very important because we need to understand that we need not only to listen to other voices, which is a little bit a patronizing approach, we are the powerful and we listen to the others. I think that we need to change the perspective. What we need is to establish a dialogue with the other voices, and the other voices, maybe they would like to establish a dialogue with us, which is a very different perspective. This is also related to the multiple identities around the world that we need to recognize, and we need to after, if we are now in the end of this kind of coercive promotion of democracy, it's very important to recognize these different identities and the dialogue with them. Just to finish, let me give you some examples. For example, yesterday I was in a debate in Washington in a seminar about the Obama administration and Latin America, and it was very interesting that the key actor in the 6 hours of the seminar was Brazil. I mean, it was not the United States. Also, if we discuss Afghanistan and Pakistan, we need to discuss with India, with Russia, with Iran, and with China. And in the Middle East, only 2 or 3 years ago, the only actors, external actors, were the United States and Europe. Now is Turkey, for example, and Saudi Arabia. Without Turkey, we don't have a real dialogue in the Middle East or perspective for negotiations. So this is not only about diplomacy or great games of diplomacy. I think it's a recognition of the kind of new world that we are living.
Thank you very much. It is now 8 minutes till the closing ceremony, so rather than wrapping up in a nice way, I will just let the guillotine fall and say to the panelists, thank you very much for your interventions, for the audience, for participating, and for listening. So, thank you.